On the 24th of February 2022, the Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his troops to invade Ukraine through the eastern border of Ukraine. An invasion which has been imminent since the existence of the Cold War in 2013 between Russia and Ukraine.
Считаем и будем считать, что Украина наш не только ближайший сосед, а действительно наша братская.
But the big question is, why the invasion and why now? For better understanding of the why, let us take a look at the genesis and the historical backing of this invasion, which links back to the Second World War, which took place in the 1940s. During the Second World War, which was initiated by a formed alliance called the Axis Powers, which was made up of three nations, namely Japan, who was then led by Emperor Hirohito, Germany, who was then led by Adolf Hitler, and the then Kingdom of Italy, who was also then led by the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, collectively waged war in Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa, with the malicious intention of Germany wanting to rule and control the whole of Europe. Japan, who also wanted to take over and rule the whole of Asia, and the then Kingdom of Italy, who also wanted to take over and rule the whole of Northern Africa. But with the collective effort of the United States of America, who was then led by Franklin Roosevelt, France, who was then led by General Charles de Gaulle, the United Kingdom, who was then led by Sir Winston Churchill, Russia, who was then referred to as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that is USSR, was then also led by Joseph Stalin, together with their respective allies, countered and defeated the Axis powers, which eventually ended the Second World War on the September 2nd, 1945. So before the end of World War II, the United States of America and Russia were both good allies who fought together side by side against one common enemy, which was the Axis powers. It is important to note that the United States of America was very instrumental in ending the Second World War, since the Germans had already conquered the whole of Europe, Poland, Austria, and were marching towards England in order to invade her. An invasion that was prevented and countered by the timely intervention of the United States of America. So why, when, and what caused the tension and the Cold War which currently exists between the United States of America and Russia, who after the end of the World War II have become enemies? The answers to these questions and the root cause of the tension, the fallout and the Cold War between the United States of America and Russia began after the end of the World War II, when the 32nd President of the United States of America, who was Franklin Roosevelt, and his then Vice President, Harry Truman, became the 33rd President of the United States of America. A change of presidency that changed the scope of the world order. As every individual has his or her own beliefs and understanding of life, so did the 33rd President of the United States of America, Harry Truman, who was an all-time capitalist, and as a result, wanted every country in the world to become a capitalist state. That is, all countries should be allowed to have a free economy and should practice democracy, a decision that Joseph Stalin wasn't happy about because he was a communist. So after the defeat of the Axis powers and the end of the World War II, which was made possible by the collective efforts of the United States of America, France, the United Kingdom, and Russia, who are all currently considered as the world's superpower countries, collectively shared countries which were under the full control of member states of the Axis powers among themselves, including the whole of Germany, which was made up of the West Germany, which was taken over and ruled by the British with a capitalist regime, a quarter of Southern Germany, which was also taken over and ruled by the French, also with a capitalist regime, majority of Southern Germany, which was also taken over and ruled by the United States of America, also with a capitalist regime, and lastly the East Germany, which was formerly ruled by Adolf Hitler, but after the end of the Second World War was taken over and ruled by the Russians, then the USSR, with a communist regime. But among the newly emerged superpower countries, United States of America became the most powerful among the three world superpower countries when the then US President Harry S. Truman offered to rebuild the whole of Western Europe, including the whole of Germany, which was entirely devastated by the war as a result of the high level of destruction which was caused during the World War II. So for the purpose of rebuilding Western Europe, the then US President Harry S. Truman instructed his Secretary of State, who was General Marshall, to develop a 50-year roadmap for the rebuilding of the entire Europe and its economy, which was rolled out in the year 1974 and successfully ended in the year 2017, a decision that has made the entire Europe what it is today. Though the 50 years rebuilding plan, which till date is known as the Marshall Plan, was intended not to only rebuild East Germany, but also the entire Europe, the idea of East Germany, which before the Second World War was under the rule of Adolf Hitler, but after the Second World War was taken over and ruled by the Russians, will be re-empowered again by the rebuilding plan of the entire Europe, caused tension, fear and panic among all other European countries, including France, Netherlands and West Germany, which resulted in a Cold War between the aggrieved countries, the US and Russia. So based on the same fear of East Germany under the rule of Russia could possibly cause another security instability which was imminent with the empowerment of East Germany, who actually was the frontier of the Axis powers in the Second World War under the rule of Adolf Hitler. All the aggrieved Western European countries, that is the United Kingdom, Denmark, France, Netherlands, Canada, Portugal, Norway, Southern Germany, Belgium, Iceland, West Germany, Italy, and Luxembourg formed an alliance called NATO, which at the time of its formation wasn't as powerful until the United States of America joined in the same year of its formation, that is in the year 1949. The formation of NATO caused a high tension between NATO member states and the Soviet Union member states, which at the time was made up of Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Latvia, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, together with countries like Albania, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, who were all saved by Russia, then USSR, from Adolf Hitler's invasion. It's important to note that these saved countries together formed the Warsaw Pact Alliance, which was headquartered in the capital town of Poland. The tension between the member states of NATO and both the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries didn't just result to a Cold War among its member states. It has also resulted to many proxy wars, such as the Colombia War, the Libya War, the Angola War, the Congo War, the Namibia War, the Somalia War, the Afghanistan War, the Kuwait War, the Vietnam War, the Korea War, the Iraq War, the invasion of Grenada and Panama, and so many other proxy wars, which has caused the downfall of so many countries. So to simply put, all the combat war that took place after the Second World War, in actual fact, was as a result of the tension between the US and Russia. A typical example of a direct proxy war caused as a result of the tension between US and Russia is the Korea War, which was initiated by the invasion of South Korea, which was then under the control of the capitalist regime by the US, into the North Korea, which was also under the control of Russia and was being ruled with communist regime after the end of the Second World War. So if you wonder how and why the North Korea till date is a communist state and is at loggerheads with the US, is because the North Korea was once under the rule of Russia. Another example of a direct proxy war caused as a result of the tension between the US and the Russia is the Vietnam War, which lasted for 20 years, starting from the year 1955 through to 1975, between the North Vietnam, which was then supported by the USSR, and the Southern Vietnam, which was also then supported by the US. The Vietnam War took place in South Vietnam, and because the Vietnam War was actually between the world's most superpower countries, that is Russia and US, most of their respective allies also joined in the fight of the Vietnam War, which in addition to the 580,000 soldiers from Southern Vietnam, the 50,000 troops from South Korea, and the 580,000 US troops together fought over 1 million soldiers and civilians from both Northern Vietnam and Russia. Though the US did everything in order to win this particular war, the US suffered a lot of casualties and as a result had to pull out from the war, making them lose this war. So hence, anytime you hear of a war, don't be quick to judge. Try finding out about the major allies supporting the two sides involved in that particular war. With the main root cause of all the proxy wars in the world after the Second World War known, let us now find out how the current conflict war between Russia and Ukraine is linked to a proxy war, which have its roots linking as far back as in the year 1962, when the Soviet Union, which is Russia today, wanted to place some missiles in Cuba, a country which was then being ruled by Castro with the support of Russia under a communist regime. Though Cuba was known to be supported by and was under the control of Russia, Cuba wanted to be part of the Warsaw Pact, which was a group well known as Russia allies. But because Cuba was a direct neighbor to the US, Cuba becoming a member of the Warsaw Pact was seen as a threat to the US, since Russia was also seeking to have a military satellite base in Cuba, which in actual fact could have been a breeding ground for Russia to easily coordinate an attack against the US. For this particular reason, US did everything within her means to prevent Cuba from being part of the Warsaw Pact, and as well as having any union with Russia. Though the US did everything to stop and prevent Cuba from having any direct union with Russia, Russia and Cuba both took a bold step to still place Russian missiles in Cuba. A bold move which was again prevented by a US naval blockade. A blockade which was made up of some number of US naval warships with two of their nuclear warheads, which resulted in a heat tension between Cuba, Russia and the US, and later developed into another proxy war in Cuba, which was referred to as the Cuban Missiles Crisis. A war which became a major turning point in relation to the tension between the US and Russia. Many years down the line, on the same basis of Cuba being a direct neighbor to the US, and as a result, the US prevented Russia from planting a remote military site in Cuba. The US was successful in planting a military base in Turkey, who was also a direct neighbor to Russia. Aside this unprecedented move, the US proceeded and successfully convinced all Russia allies, who together formed the Warsaw Pact, including the main host nation, that is Poland, to join NATO. A move that caused Russia to lose most of her allies, and as a result, angered Russia and led Russia to decide never to allow any of her remaining allies to form or join any allies that the US will belong to or belongs to. From this map, it is clear that the US wasn't just successful in taking away all Russia's allies. The US was equally successful in converting all Russian allies who were running the communist regime to accept the US capitalist regime of ruling. Also from this same map, it is clear that there are only two remaining Russian allies left. That is Belarus, which is a pro-Russian state, Crimea, which was originally part of Ukraine until 2014, when the then pro-Russia president of Ukraine was ousted from his office due to the western part of Ukraine being a pro-Western, while the eastern part of Ukraine, where the then pro-Russia president of Ukraine resided from, was pro-Russia. So in order for Russia to maintain the pro-Russia state of the eastern part of Ukraine, that is Crimea, Russia annexed Crimea in order to secure it as a full pro-Russia state. A calculated move that was to prevent Ukraine from being eligible to join NATO, since one of the basic conditions of NATO for a new member state to be part of it is not to have any of his or her borderland being disputed with another country. But because both the US and Ukraine were all determined to be part of NATO, Ukraine refused to challenge Russia over her borderland, which is Crimea, a move that still makes Ukraine qualified and eligible to become a NATO member state. But because Ukraine is the biggest state among the remaining Russia pro-allies, and the fact that Ukraine itself has since been divided into two, with majority of her citizens seeking to be part of the Western Bloc, while few of her citizens seeks to remain pro-Russia. Ukraine since 2015 became a threat to Russia when Ukraine made her first move to join NATO.
Мы употребим все наше влияние, чтобы в этой стране воцарились мир и спокойствие.
The other toward Western Europe.
We call on all sides to put an end to violence immediately.
A union that Russia has vowed never to allow, leading to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Since Russia considers Ukraine being part of NATO as an attack from the US. In other words, if Ukraine should be successful in becoming a NATO member state, it will be a symbolic defeat of Russia to the US. Since the United States of America has always wanted to convert all Russia pro-allies from being a communist state to becoming a pro-capitalist nation since the end of the Second World War. Another truth behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine hosts Russia's largest nuclear plant and many of Russia's missiles. So indeed, Russia actually has a lot to lose if Ukraine is successful in becoming a NATO member. Another reason of Russia's invasion to Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine has a lot of natural gas reserve, which can actually position Ukraine to be a global competitor to Russia with the help of the US in the business of natural gas. Aside Ukraine becoming a possible global competitor to Russia in relation to natural gas business, Ukraine hosts majority of Russia's supply gas pipeline to Europe, which is a major source of Russia's income, a source that Russia cannot afford to lose. Another reason for Russia invading Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine is the fourth largest recipient military support from the US in the world, which Russia considers as a threat, since the US can easily coordinate an attack on Russia through Ukraine. But aside the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, was there any better alternative to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO? Yes, there was, but it wasn't futile because of how it was dealt with by Ukraine. This was the attempt of Russia to have a dispute with Ukraine over its borderland, Crimea, a move that Russia sought to use to prevent and disqualify Ukraine from becoming a NATO member state, since one of the basic requirements of being a NATO member state is to not have any borderland dispute with any other country. But because Ukraine decided not to dispute Crimea with Russia, Ukraine still remained qualified to join NATO. It is important to note that these reasons doesn't seek to justify Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Another question is, why is the US and other superpower countries not able to directly intervene in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia? The answer to this question is, aside the many reasons, Russia is militarily considered as the most powerful country in the world. So messing up with Russia can trigger and cause a third world war, a war that the whole world wouldn't want. Another answer to this question is the fact that Russia in a way is right to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, since the US did everything to prevent Russia from having a strong tie with Cuba, on the note that Cuba was a direct neighbor to the US. Another strong reason is the fact that as long as Ukraine hasn't yet joined NATO, the US and other Western countries cannot intervene in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia because as it stands, Ukraine is still an ally to Russia. The last question is, what is the side effect if Russia should be successful in preventing Ukraine from joining NATO? The answer to this question is, the success of Russia preventing Ukraine from joining NATO will set a precedent to allow countries like China to invade Taiwan and also for North Korea to equally invade South Korea. For these reasons, US and NATO will make sure Russia is not successful in preventing or stopping Ukraine from joining NATO. My advice to you is, the next time you hear of a war, before you judge into conclusion, try studying the allies backing the two sides involved in the war before you jump into conclusion.